Chapter 25, Floating Dead Leaves. Mayu had never really stood out, but when she passed the exam for the academy, her mother bought her a bag that she had been pining over for the past few months, a bright blue, fluffy ball-shaped one. Her big brother Izumo gave her the look when he saw her wearing it for the first time. Mayu. I don't know how to break this to you, but you're going to be made fun of. Mayu stuck her tongue out at him and ran to school, where she found out that her brother, like always, was 100% correct. As soon as the teacher left the lecture hall, some of the other children gathered around her and ripped the bag off her back. What is this? You call yourself a ninja? Ha! I say it's perfect. An ugly bag for an ugly girl. They began to throw it back and forth amongst each other, and when she grabbed for it, they threw it on the ground. Feeling bewildered and overwhelmed, amidst their laughter, she felt her eyes grow hot with tears. She had wanted to be noticed, but now she wished they would leave her alone. Suddenly, she felt a shadow on her face. Looking up, she saw a dark-haired boy staring down at her, Rai. Mayu knew him, of course. He was in her class, and unlike her, he had a lot of friends. His older brother Kotetsu was also Izumo's best friend. Kotetsu brought him along sometimes, but the most they'd done was silently sit in opposite ends of the sandbox while their brothers talked. Rai scowled at her, and for a second she thought he would yell at her. He picked up her bag, and she flinched, but then, he slung it over his back. Real ninja can wear anything, he told the stunned children. It was the best day of her life, the day when she made her first friend. The worst day of her life followed shortly afterwards. It began when Mayu found herself hiding from her brother in a shrub, right under the kitchen window. Mayu! She heard Izumo yell out, as he stormed into the kitchen. A dry leaf poked uncomfortably into her cheek, but she dared not move. Izumo was a lot older than her and a chunin. He would find her right away if she made a single sound. But over the years, Mayu had gotten quite adept at avoiding detection by her brother, a fact that both pleased and infuriated him. Mother, have you seen Mayu? What is it now? She heard their mother laugh. Hearing her ringing laugh brought a smile to Mayu's face. Their mother was the nicest person in the village, and made the best cakes to boot. Her mother was baking one now, and the smell of the crispy apple filling made her salivate. She skipped going to the academy today again. Izumo complained. It reflects badly on me that my own sister is like this, you know. I'd say it's healthier for a child to be running around, having fun, than to be sitting in a classroom learning how to kill people, their mother said in a mild tone. She could practically hear Izumo roll his eyes. Oh, not this again. Their mother did not approve of Mayu attending the academy. Though she'd never said why, Izumo had told Mayu it was because their father had died years ago in battle. Izumo, on the other hand, wanted her to at least learn the basics of defending herself. There had been a big fight over it, she remembered. But Izumo won in the end, and she'd had to start attending the academy. On the bright side, Rai was there, so it wasn't so bad. But it was so boring. Mayu didn't care about learning how to set traps or throwing a shuriken with perfect precision. She would much rather run around the village with Rai, listening to all the merchants' stories at the market, looking at the clouds in the sky, and watching birds eat bread crumbs from her hands. There was a light slapping sound. No, don't eat it, their mother said. What? Why not? Izumo whined. It's not for you. Then who? It's not someone's birthday, is it? There was a small pause. You don't mean you're making a cake for that thing, are you? Mayu's ears perked up. What thing was this? Their mother said quietly, and what if I am? I thought. Izumo hesitated. I thought we had agreed that you were going to keep your distance from it. I don't even understand why Hokage-sama's put you up to this. He knows it's because of that thing, that father. I have raised that child for the past 3 years, said their mother. And I have kept my distance. But the more I see him, the more I realize that he doesn't understand anything. He doesn't know anything. He's only a child, like Mayu. At the mention of her name, Mayu gulped and uttered a silent prayer that she would never be caught eavesdropping. How could you say that? Izumo sounded angry. Have you even seen what that thing looks like? It's not a human, it's the damn fox itself. That's just the Uzumaki clan trait, and you know it, Izumo. It's Naruto's 6th birthday tomorrow, and he's never even had a cake, so heavens help me, I am making him one. And that's final. Of course, after all that, Mayu had to see the boy for herself. The other kids jeered about him sometimes, but she'd never met him before. However, he wasn't hard to find. She soon caught his face peeking out of an apartment window by the market. He was the complete opposite of Mayu, easy to single out, with his bright red hair and unique facial markings. She waved up at him. "Hi there." Immediately, his face disappeared from view. She frowned, and tried again. "Do you want to play hide-and-seek?" There was no response, and she was about to give up, when she heard a small voice. "I don't know how to." What a weird kid, she thought. "That's okay, I'll teach you," she said. "I'm Mayu." "What's your name?" "Naruto." It was a bright sunny day out, but for some reason, Naruto seemed reluctant to leave his apartment. Nonetheless, with some coaxing, Mayu was leading him towards the park when they ran into Rai, who was throwing shuriken at a homemade target. Looking curious, he wandered over. "What are you doing? And who's that?" "This is the boy my mom's taking care of." She gestured back at Naruto. "Come on, say hello." Hello." "Hold on, I know him." Rai peered at Naruto, who shrank backwards. "Yeah, he's the one Kayumo's mom told us to stay away from." "Really? Why?" Rai shrugged. "I dunno. She got mad at Kayumo for letting him join our game of tag." "Why would she? He's just a kid like us." Mayu smiled encouragingly down at Naruto. "Right?" At first the boy didn't respond, and she was about to turn around and call it quits, when his whiskered face broke out into a small smile. How cute, she thought. She couldn't have been more wrong. It all happened so suddenly. One moment, she was pulling Naruto by the hand, and the next, they were surrounded by a group of armed figures. They didn't wear the hitayate of any villages, they were rogue ninja. Mayu wished she had paid more attention at the academy, but it was too late for that. She was helpless, and was soon immobilized. Though Rai put up more of a fight, trying to fight back with his shuriken, even he couldn't do anything. One of the rogues threw a kunai at him, and Rai let out a howl of pain as it struck his cheek in a splash of blood. Another rogue hit the back of his head, and then Rai was on the ground, unmoving. Now, they were somewhere underground, below the village, the sewers. She knew some of the older kids sometimes sneaked in there, but she hadn't dared to, until now. They'd never mentioned how suffocating it was, being surrounded on all four sides with no windows or doors. There was only darkness, the dirty smell of sewage, and the sound of running water. Mayu had never been so scared in her life. The narrow walls of the tunnel around her seemed like they were shrinking around her, and she couldn't breathe. Her heart was pounding so hard in her chest, it hurt. All of a sudden, the rogue who was holding Mayu stopped. There was sweat on his hands, and it seeped into her mouth. "They're coming." The warning came not a moment too soon, as three dark figures swooped down from the ceiling. They wore animal masks, the ANBU. The rogues around her drew their weapons, and immediately engaged them. Amidst the clanging and screaming of metal meeting metal, Mayu felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know much about the mysterious masked ninja, but they were reputed as some of the best in the village. Surely, she thought, they were safe now. "Stop!" The rogue holding Mayu cried out. Something cold and sharp touched her neck. "If you don't, I'll kill her here and now." All three ANBU froze. "Mayu!" One of them shouted. It took a moment for her to recognize the voice behind the mask. It was her mother. Then, knowing that, she could no longer hold back the tears. "Mom!" She struggled to free herself, but the man's grip was too strong. "Your daughter. Lucky us. How's this for a trade then? You let us go with the Jinchuriki, and we give you these two other kids back." There was a pause. "Very well," said a male ANBU's voice. The bruising hold on Mayu slackened, and the other rogues began to retreat, taking Naruto's limp body with them. Tears and slime streaming down her face, Mayu ran into her mother's tight embrace. For a moment, all was well. She could hear her mother breathing in her ear, and she breathed back in hers. One of the ANBU stepped up to them, sounding worried. "What are we going to tell Hokage-sama?" "That we were unable to rescue the Jinchuriki," said the male. "This is our chance to get rid of that thing. We'll be lucky if they kill it." Mayu wished with all her heart that she could get out of that horrible dark tunnel. She wanted to sleep in her mother's arms that night and forget that this had all ever happened. But she couldn't stop thinking about how Naruto had smiled up at her. "What? What about Naruto? She said in a small voice. Her mother's hold on her body tightened. Mayu felt her heart beating rapidly against hers. And then her mother pulled away and stood up. I'm going after them. What are you talking about? The male ANBU sounded confused. You, of all people. This is what you've always wanted. Just leave the creature. Her mother shook her head, and looked straight at Mayu. What kind of ninja are we, if we abandon a child here? The male ANBU scoffed. He's a monster. Her mother didn't say anything. Instead, she drew her sword, and then she was gone, swallowed up in the darkness of the tunnel. Mayu was never sure about what happened next. The other ANBU took Rai and left, but Mayu refused to leave without her mother. The male ANBU was on the verge of dragging her out of the tunnel, when he suddenly froze. She wondered what had happened, when it hit her, like a wave. She'd never felt chakra like this before. It was the most overwhelming, terrible thing she'd ever felt. It choked her, it covered her. And then she saw him. It was Naruto. He was coming back, alone. But there was something strange about him. There was a bright red shroud covering his entire body, and he walked on all fours like an animal. Mayu hesitated. Naruto. The male ANBU shouted, get away from him. He'll kill you. She flinched back, and the male ANBU raced forward, holding his sword before him. He was going to kill Naruto, but then, faster than she could follow, a blur of red jumped into the air. There was a loud, terrible cracking sound, and she realized with a jolt that Naruto had bit into and broken the ANBU's neck. The man gurgled, his hands grasping belatedly at his ragged neck. His body twitched a few times, before slumping down. The thing landed back in the water with a splash. Letting out a sob, Mayu tried to step back, but fell over instead. It was drawing closer. The red shroud around its body swung back and forth like a tail. There was something dark dripping off of its face. It was the ANBU's blood. Where's my mom? She cried. What did you do? It was right before her now, and she could see its red, slit eyes. It looked at her, and she looked at it, and she knew in her heart that she was looking in the face of a monster. Something heavy struck her in the head and she felt herself fall over. She could hear muffled shouting in the distance. Her body was sinking into something warm and thick. And then everything turned black. When Mayu opened her eyes again, her mother was dead, and her entire world had changed. Rai couldn't remember anything. Having been knocked out, he'd missed the entire thing. The only indication that something had ever happened to him was a long, ropey scar on his face. Ironically enough, Mayu escaped the incident physically unscathed. During her short stay in the hospital, she found herself surrounded by members of the intelligence division who asked her questions after questions. She didn't say much, only responding that she couldn't remember what had happened, until the Hokage himself came to her room and made them leave. The day she was discharged, when she arrived at her house door, she stopped and knocked. Nobody answered, and after a while, she let herself in. Izumo wasn't there. She hadn't seen her brother since he'd visited her, red-eyed, in the hospital. The only thing left in the house was a stale cake. It rained for days afterward, as though the skies themselves were crying. But Mayu couldn't cry anymore. The whole world had turned gray, and she didn't shed a single tear. Years passed in that way. Izumo stopped coming home, using his work as an excuse. It rained, and rained. Eventually, Mayu graduated from the academy. She was placed in the same team as the monster, and she knew that she was being punished by the heavens. Their Jonin sensei gave them a test, and Mayu would have been content to fail if it meant she wouldn't have to be around the monster anymore. But the monster brought to her and Rai a plan, and it worked. Their team began going on missions. Even though Mayu often lost her concentration in the monster's presence, it never lost its patience with her. It was intelligent and strong, and sometimes, she had to stop herself from admiring it. One day, on a bodyguard mission, the monster killed several bandit men. It was expressionless about it, its face dripping with blood. Mayu had expected as much. Later that night, she passed by its wagon and heard a sound. Pulling out her kunai, she went inside, and saw the monster shaking in its sleep. It was having a nightmare. Its face looked younger than usual, more vulnerable. Mayu wasn't so weak, however. She didn't let it deceive her. But soon afterwards, the monster had to go and save someone. A young civilian boy. Without any regard for itself, the monster jumped in front of the boy and was hit by a shard of metal. It would have died, if it had been normal. It turned out that Kakashi-sensei knew about the monster as well. He told her about how the monster was something called a Jinchuriki and how a tailed beast had been sealed inside it as a baby. That night, Mayu knelt by the monster's side. She could tell it was awake, and she heard their breathing synchronize in the darkness. She looked at its face for a long time. She held its hand, and she decided to give in to the deception. Things got easier after that. It became he. The monster became Naruto. She stopped flinching every time Naruto was near her. When Naruto praised her, she began to feel proud, and when he seemed disappointed in her, she trained harder. She started wondering about how Naruto was eating. She baked him a birthday cake, and she could tell that he didn't like it, but he ate it all without a word of complaint. And then one evening, she found herself sitting at Ramen Ichiraku with the others. Kakashi-sensei was reading his adult books. She and Rai weren't arguing for once, and the three of them were digging into their bowls. Mayu finished first, and when she looked up, she caught sight of Naruto smiling faintly into his ramen. Her chest throbbed. Ichiraku buzzed with the sound of customers, and the store's glowing lanterns bobbed in the night breeze. The rich smell of miso ramen wafted out through the hanging flaps. Something wet and hot dripped down her face. The world wasn't so gray after all, she thought. As always, Rai was the first to notice. They had reached the last of the trees, and the seemingly endless marshlands spread out before them. The others had already landed on the marsh ground, and right as Naruto was about to jump down, he saw Rai come to a screeching stop. "Wait!" he cried out. And then Naruto saw it, a blue feather, floating down through the air. When he reached out for it with his hand, the moment it touched his palm, a sudden influx of images rushed into his mind's eye. The sound of wings flapped in the air above him, and he looked up just in time to see a bluebird soaring past the treetops, into the sky. He blinked, and then it was gone. Chapter 26, Lightless Struggle. It emerged from the roiling fog without warning, a great maw of a cave, built into the underside of a rocky cliff. There must have been something repelling the fog there, as a scattered system of smaller caves quickly came into view. At the moment, it appeared to be deserted and void of any activity. However, Naruto knew with certainty that just hours before, it had been crawling with sentries. True, there were signs here and there, scattered cigarette butts, and the whitened ashes of an old campfire. But moreover, he had seen it before, in his mind's eye. By touching the feather of one of Mayu's bluebirds, Naruto had received an influx of its memories. Everything the bird had seen and heard since Naruto and his team had pretended to leave Wave Country, was now a part of his own memory. It covered the events he had missed at the procession, including Jiraiya's clash with the three missing Nin. That particular memory continued to show Mayu and Tazuna being taken away by Kakuzu. The final memory was of his teammate, who seemed to have somehow escaped, defending herself against two assailants in the fog-covered marshlands. Unfortunately, Sai's ink rats were unable to find Mayu in the vicinity. With time running out, their best hope was that she had been recaptured and was being held captive at Gato's hideout. Naruto felt a bead of sweat trickle down his brow. There was a simpler alternative to that possibility. Mayu had sent that bluebird to them for a reason, it had been a warning. But it seemed Mayu had not known Naruto as well as she must have thought, for he deliberately chose not to consider it. As Naruto and the others crouched behind a cluster of shrubs, he glanced at Rai, who was regarding the hideout in silence. In the place of his usual chatter, he had not spoken once since Sai's ink rats had returned. Naruto could only imagine what thoughts were going through his head. Several minutes passed, and in a surge of impatience, Rai rose up and made a move to step forward. Blocking the way with his arm, Naruto shook his head, when two shadowy figures emerged from the cave's entrance. "They're out there, all right." "I can smell the money," said one. "Ha!" The other raised his nose and sniffed the air. "I don't smell anything." It was Kakuzu and Haiden, and at the sight of the latter, Naruto stiffened in surprise. In the bird's memory, he had seen Jiraiya inflicting horrific burns on Haiden scarcely hours beforehand. Now, the only signs it had ever happened were faint scarring. Jiraiya appeared to be wondering the same thing. "Here I thought I'd finally rid the world of one of you crazies." Stepping past Naruto, he emerged from his hiding spot. "Where's the Jinchuriki?" Kakuzu asked, his pupilless eyes slowly searching the area. Jiraiya chuckled. "If you mean Naruto, he's on his way back home to Konoha." "That's unfortunate to hear." So if you'll just get out of my way, I'll take back the two you took from us, and be on my merry way. What do you think? Enough with the banter, Kakuzu growled. Shirakumo was already dead. He had succumbed to a bizarre jutsu that connected Haiden's body to his. The Jonin's body lay crumpled on the ground, blood still seeping from the hole in his chest. Panting, Rai flipped back and warily regarded the missing Nin, who currently wore an expression of utter ecstasy. He had known it, but Haiden was strong. Overwhelmingly strong. He had grown stronger since their time in Yugakure. Even Sai seemed to understand the trouble they were in. He hadn't cracked a single insult since the battle had begun. Isn't it about time you made yourself useful? Sai panted. Well, it had been a good run. I don't see you doing anything either, Rai snapped back. Haiden kissed an amulet that hung around his neck and his black and white skin returned to its original color. Rai shot a look back up at Gato's hideout, but it was quiet. He had to assume Naruto was still searching for Mayu and Tazuna. In the meantime, it was their job to keep Haiden busy. Ink birds began to dive in kamikaze style, exploding around Haiden. Rai drew his kunai blades from his back, the chains connecting the dual blades clanking dully. That day in Yugakure, Rai had been knocked out before he could do anything. Naruto had gotten most of the glory then, as he usually did, and Rai had sworn to himself that he would get his revenge. Haiden had grown stronger, but he hadn't spent the past few years idly either. The fireball that had consumed the tunnel sputtered away into nothing, and Naruto stared up at the dome of ice that protected both him and the hunter Nin. If he wasn't mistaken, it had just saved his life. But why? As he watched, the dome disappeared, and Naruto lowered his gaze. The hunter Nin, panting in exertion, stood well within his reach. The fireball had been the final blow, the tunnel ceiling had collapsed in, and amidst the rubble, they now stood exposed to the outside air. The sun had set while he was inside the hideout, and he found himself awash in the glow of moonlight. The shouts of battle echoed in the distance, the earth rumbled from the movements of Jiraiya's toad summon. For the first time, the hunter Nin spoke. The girl, was she one of yours? His voice was higher than Naruto had expected. She did that to your hand. It wasn't a question. Yes. Where is she? The hunter Nin didn't respond, and in his silence, Naruto knew. In that moment, as though he had been doused in ice-cold water, everything became clear. Powering his feet with chakra, he thrust his tanto forward. The hunter Nin jerked back in surprise, a fraction too late. The blade cleaved straight through his swollen arm. Yellow pus and dark blood burst out as the severed limb fell away, splattering Naruto's face. Staggering back, the hunter Nin let out a piercing scream, and as though heeding his call, a blast of icy air began emanating from his body. His scream morphed into the sound of crackling frost, and before he knew it, Naruto found himself trapped in another dome. This time, it was made out of mirrored ice. The sky grew thick with gray clouds and the moonlight faded. It began to snow. Though Zabuza had disappeared into the mist, Kakashi could sense the thick bloodthirst churning in the vicinity. He knew what was coming. Silent killing, it was one of the most feared assassination techniques. He didn't fear for his own life, however. The greater risk was to Tazuna. Though the older man's composure up to this point was remarkable, his fear was becoming increasingly tangible. Don't worry, Tazuna-san, said Kakashi, making a reassuring smile. You're in my charge now. I won't let you die. It was then that Zabuza chose to strike. I wonder about that. Seemingly out of nowhere, the missing Nin materialized behind Tazuna, raising his sword to deliver the finishing blow, but Kakashi had been waiting. His Sharingan glowing, he turned around and plunged his kunai straight into the man's chest. It was not blood but water that dripped down the handle and fell to the ground. Another Zabuza emerged from the mist behind Kakashi, and the water clone he had struck instead melted away. Letting out a roar, Zabuza swung his sword in a formidable arc, cleaving Kakashi's body cleanly in two. For a moment, his eyes gleamed with triumph, which then turned into confusion, as the Jonin's body also melted away into water. Don't move. Kakashi held a kunai to the missing Nin's neck, his Sharingan fixed on his target. It's over. And yet, Zabuza looked far from defeated. Clever. You used your Sharingan to mimic my hiding in mist technique. But if you think that's enough, you're sorely mistaken. Once more, another Zabuza materialized behind them. Kakashi stiffened in alarm as the clone he'd been holding hostage dissipated. It had been a trick within a trick, before raising his steel-plated gloves up just in time to block the coming blow. They stood at a standstill, sword grinding against steel. Their bodies shook from the tremendous force being put in on both ends, and then they burst apart, each leaping away from the other. As Kakashi landed, he felt something cold and wet land on the tip of his nose. It took him a second to process what it was. Snow. For some reason, the snow seemed to give Zabuza pause. When he moved again, he was visibly shaken, and Kakashi seized the opportunity. As the missing nin raised a hand into the air to start his technique, Kakashi mirrored his motion. Before the other could react, the Jonin's hands blurred, finishing the jutsu he had been about to start. Suetun, Daibakufu no Jutsu, Water Style, Great Waterfall Technique. Zabuza reeled back in shock. A muddy vortex of water rose up and claimed him. The earlier fight against Shirakumo must have drained Haiden more than Rai had expected, for the missing nin's movements seemed sluggish. As Sai provided backup, they eventually managed to corner the missing nin. With a lunge, Rai drove his kunai blade into Haiden's back, twisting it deep into his heart. Any ordinary person would have been long dead by now, but Haiden looked irritated instead. "I've told you, it's useless." Reaching back, he grabbed Rai and forcefully hurled him into the air. Flying backwards, the chain connecting Rai's blades clinked in the wind and suddenly, it gave him an idea. It all happened in an instant. Even as Sai's ink snakes swarmed him, Haiden lobbed his scythe after Rai. It whistled through the air, its 3 blades gleaming. He had a choice to make, and he made it. Even as the scythe plunged into his own chest, Rai used his remaining strength to throw his remaining kunai blade back at Haiden. Momentarily immobilized, Haiden watched the chains wrap tightly around his body, the blade still lodged in his back acting as an anchor. Finally, the chains ran out and the swinging kunai blade sliced straight through Haiden's neck, decapitating him. "Let's see you recover from that." Rai grinned, and his body hit the ground. By the time the water released Zabuza, slamming him against the ground and receding from around his body, the missing nin was spent. Kakashi held a kunai to his neck and at last, Zabuza bowed his head in defeat. "It's over," Kakashi said coldly. "Now tell me, where are my students?" Zabuza's face twisted. He opened his mouth. Naruto knew what was coming a split second before it happened. Kakuzu's hand shot out far past its reach, attached to its body by hundreds of thick black threads. It was how he had taken Mayu captive in the first place, at the procession. Jiraiya bit into his finger and slammed his fist into the ground. Kuchios no Jutsu, Summoning Technique. The ground shook. From a cloud of hissing smoke, something gigantic and red emerged, towering high above their heads. The sound of keening metal rang in the air as Shirakumo drew his weapon. Meanwhile, ink splattered across Sai's open scroll and an ink lion roared into existence. Before he left, Rai looked back at Naruto, and finally spoke, "It's in your hands." With that, he ran out to join the others. Haiden let out an elated laugh. 1, 2, 3 of you. Jashin-sama will be pleased with today's offering." It was time to get to work. Stepping back, Naruto concentrated and felt the chakra in his body begin to vibrate. Electricity began crackling around his feet. Masking his presence in the confusion of the starting battle, he shot across the open ground towards the mouth of the cave, and he was in. The plan they had put together was a simple one. While the others distracted the Akatsuki members, Naruto would look for Mayu and Tazuna. Once they were secured, their top priority was putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the missing nin. It wasn't an ideal plan, and the risks were high, but the others, with perhaps the exception of Sai, had all readily gotten on board. Whereas the outside of Gato's hideout had appeared to be completely abandoned, the inside was a different story. A large artificially excavated cavern teemed with several dozen armed men, and multiple tunnels led away to what was presumably the rest of the cave complex. Naruto began to sprint, his hands coming together to perform the sign, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique. In a single identical motion, he and his clones drew their tanto. "Hey, what the?" The first man to notice broke off into a strangled gurgle. His mind had been teeming with the chatter of 100 questions before, but it was silent now. The only thing on his mind was a series of twisted faces jeering down at an unconscious body. Sparks of electricity flashed. Spurts of bright blood splashed onto the cave walls, and twitching bodies fell to the ground. The armed men were genin level at best, they were no match for Naruto and his clones, who made short work of them. Soon, there was only one man left. He was a short man in an expensive suit, and was the shipping magnate locally feared as Gato. He had ruined the lives of many civilians, but none of that meant anything to Naruto. For him, Gato was yet another body in his way. The entire time, Gato had been backed up against the farthest corner of the cavern. Naruto turned towards him now, and he let out a yelp. He scrabbled backwards, knocking his own glasses askew. His squinty eyes fearfully watched Naruto advancing toward him. The smell of fresh urine stained the air. "W8. What do you want?" "If it's money, I have a lot of." Naruto slashed his tanto across the man's front, killing him. As the body crumpled to the floor, Naruto wiped the blade clean on its suit. The salt marshlands of the Land of Waves were infamous for their ever-changing terrain. More than one luckless traveler had gone astray in the combined elements of fog and mud, and their souls were said to wander the land in search of their lost bodies. The trail had gone cold for Kakashi's hounds. The only thing they'd been able to find was a single hair clip in the shape of a bluebird. Tazuna fell to his knees. That belongs to that young girl, doesn't it?" Without responding, Kakashi lowered himself and stared at the ground. There were signs of a recent scuffle, with freshly turned dirt and broken reeds. He felt a glimmer of pride in his student. She had stood her ground against her opponents, whatever the outcome. What stood out to him most, however, was the sheen of ice covering the earth. While it seemed to be of ninjutsu origin, it was not one native to Wave Country. Clearly, outside forces were at work. Suddenly, the ground trembled. A flock of squawking marsh birds took off from a nearby shrub. Tensing, Kakashi straightened up. Was it an earthquake? Or a battle of immense proportions? It was difficult to be conclusive with the fog limiting his visibility. Still, he had to wonder what else was occurring in these marshlands. A massive sword spiraled through the air, cutting through the fog before burying itself blade first in the ground. In a flicker of movement, a bare-chested ninja appeared, resting on the handle of the sword. Kakashi's eyes narrowed. If he wasn't mistaken. If it isn't the missing Nin from the hidden mist, Momochi Zabuza. "I assume you're Kakashi of the Sharingan," said Zabuza. "I'll have you hand over that old man." Tazuna turned pale. "If that's the case, why did you all let me go in the first place?" "Let you go?" The missing Nin cocked his head. "My orders were to recapture all escapees, dead or alive. How you escaped is none of my concern." Had Kakashi known he would be clashing against a ninja of Zabuza's caliber, he would never have brought a civilian with him. It was his careless mistake that put an innocent's life at risk, and to correct it, he knew that his usual self wouldn't be enough. Making up his mind, he raised his Hitai 8, revealing the swirling tomo in his left eye. "Your opponent is me." Naruto and his clones each took a separate passageway leading away from the main cavern. The tunnels were man-made and lit by fluorescent lighting. They interconnected in a seemingly random pattern that reminded Naruto of the second test in the Chunin exam. His search was systematic. As he picked off any stragglers who had not been in the main cavern, he mentally crossed out the passageways he had already checked. This room was empty. This tunnel was a dead end. This room was also empty. And here was a dead end. And another. Naruto could feel his heart growing heavier and his focus giving way to a darker, lurking emotion. He was starting to wonder how high the tunnels ran, when with a jolt, one of his shadow clone's memories flooded his mind. Someone had sneaked up on it. It continued as one after the other, his clones were taken out. Right before his last clone disappeared, Naruto saw in its memories a blur of movement, and then he was standing alone in the tunnel. He heard it before he saw it, the subtle, almost indiscernible whistling of metal flying through air. Spinning around, Naruto brought up his tanto just in time to knock away what looked like several long needles, Senbon. They were followed by a kick that spiraled down at him, which he blocked with his forearm before thrusting his tanto forward. His assailant leaned back, allowing the blade to swing harmlessly above his chest. Then, using Naruto's arm as a springboard, he flipped backwards through the air. Taking in the ninja before him, Naruto realized two things in quick succession. One was that he wore the typical white mask of a hunter Nin from the hidden mist. The second was his right hand, which was swollen and gray in color. It was poisoned. In a flash, he saw in his mind's eye one of Mayu's poisonous birds swooping down and pecking at a dark figure. He had been mentally preparing himself for a fight with one of the three S-ranked missing Nin. He knew nothing about this ninja, or about what kind of circumstances had brought Akiri Hunter-nin all the way to Gato's hideout. None of that mattered. Sending a stream of wind chakra down his blade, Naruto struck. As the chief toad of Mount Mayaboku, while Gamabunta's giant size could dwarf even mountains, it had no bearing on his speed. With Jiraiya perched on his head, the chief's long tongue lashed out at a punishing pace, causing the earth to quake with every blow. Their opponent, however, was a freak even by Akatsuki's standards. Gamabunta's initial attack had ripped the man's body apart in two, only for the two halves to rejoin themselves using the same thick tendrils that had connected his arm to his body. Now, Kakuzu's entire body had darkened in color, and Gamabunta's attacks were no longer having as much of an effect. Evading another blow that sent tremors through the ground, Kakuzu suddenly threw himself into the air. Black tendrils from his arms bulleted straight towards Jiraiya, and before he could react, the threads wrapped themselves around his feet. The surface below him gave way, and he was hurled off the chief toad's head. Wasting no time, Kakuzu arched back and unleashed a massive blast of searing fire in his direction. Jiraiya didn't have to look back to know that the others, along with Haiden, were fighting behind him. If he didn't block the fireball, it was powerful enough to consume them all. It seemed that Kakuzu felt little sense of camaraderie for his fellow partner. Bunta! In response to his cry, Gamabunta's body swelled up. Just as the toad expelled a torrent of water towards the fireball, Jiraiya blew out, Futon, Gufu, Wind Release, Twister. A tornado twisted around the torrent, producing a cyclone that collided into the fireball. Even then, it wasn't strong enough to dispel it, splitting it instead into two walls of fire that veered off in different directions. One disappeared into the fog of the marshlands, and the other slammed into the mountainside. Kakuzu, you bastard! He heard Haiden howl. You almost hit me. A deadly rain of icicles slammed into the ground where Naruto had been standing a split second before. As the fluorescent lights flickered above them, dust rained down from the ceiling and spidery cracks appeared in the tunnel walls. The Hunter-nin was as small in stature as Naruto, and he had a suspicion that their ages weren't too far apart. However, he had never before met someone his age who could keep up with him in speed, let alone push him to this extent. Moreover, even though the Hunter-nin only had the use of his left hand, this did not seem to deter from his ability to perform seals in the slightest. Nonetheless, judging from the sounds of battle coming from outside, Naruto did not have much more time to waste. He had to finish this quickly, before anyone else got hurt. The two exchanged several more blows, neither giving way, when Naruto's tanto glanced against the swollen hand of the Hunter-nin, who visibly jerked in pain. Seizing the chance, he directed a roundhouse kick at the other male which made contact, the impact sending his body spinning through the air. Electricity surged painfully about his feet, and Naruto and three of his shadow clones shot forward, a tanto raised in each hand, ready to impale the Hunter-nin in from all directions. And then all of a sudden, coming in through the far end of the tunnel, a seething column of fire spiraled towards them, consuming everything in its path. There wasn't enough time. Naruto's momentum was carrying him forward, straight into the path of the fire. Did he know any jutsu that was powerful enough to counter it? Already, he could hear the roar and feel the heat on his face, but frantically, his mind raced through a dozen different things he could do. Hyaton, Hyogen Domu, Ice Release, Ice Rock Dome. The air around Naruto crackled, and everything around him was consumed in fire. Things were not looking good. Shirakumo was already dead. He had succumbed to a bizarre jutsu that connected Haiden's body to his. The Jonin's body lay crumpled on the ground, blood still seeping from the hole in his chest. Panting, Rai flipped back and warily regarded the missing Nin, who currently wore an expression of utter ecstasy. He had known it, but Haiden was strong. Overwhelmingly strong. He had grown stronger since their time in Yugakure. Even Sai seemed to understand the trouble they were in. He hadn't cracked a single insult since the battle had begun. Isn't it about time you made yourself useful? Sai panted. Well, it had been a good run. I don't see you doing anything either, Rai snapped back. Haiden kissed an amulet that hung around his neck and his black and white skin returned to its original color. Rai shot a look back up at Gato's hideout, but it was quiet. He had to assume Naruto was still searching for Mayu and Tazuna. In the meantime, it was their job to keep Haiden busy. Ink birds began to dive in kamikaze style, exploding around Haiden. Rai drew his kunai blades from his back, the chains connecting the dual blades clanking dully. That day in Yugakure, Rai had been knocked out before he could do anything. Naruto had gotten most of the glory then, as he usually did, and Rai had sworn to himself that he would get his revenge. Haiden had grown stronger, but he hadn't spent the past few years idly either. The fireball that had consumed the tunnel sputtered away into nothing, and Naruto stared up at the dome of ice that protected both him and the hunter Nin. If he wasn't mistaken, it had just saved his life. But why? As he watched, the dome disappeared, and Naruto lowered his gaze. The hunter Nin, panting in exertion, stood well within his reach. The fireball had been the final blow, the tunnel ceiling had collapsed in, and amidst the rubble, they now stood exposed to the outside air. The sun had set while he was inside the hideout, and he found himself awash in the glow of moonlight. The shouts of battle echoed in the distance, the earth rumbled from the movements of Jiraiya's toad summon. For the first time, the hunter Nin spoke. "The girl, was she one of yours?" His voice was higher than Naruto had expected. "She did that to your hand." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Where is she?" The hunter Nin didn't respond, and in his silence, Naruto knew. In that moment, as though he had been doused in ice-cold water, everything became clear. Powering his feet with chakra, he thrust his tanto forward. The hunter Nin jerked back in surprise, a fraction too late. The blade cleaved straight through his swollen arm. Yellow pus and dark blood burst out as the severed limb fell away, splattering Naruto's face. Staggering back, the hunter Nin let out a piercing scream, and as though heeding his call, a blast of icy air began emanating from his body. His scream morphed into the sound of crackling frost, and before he knew it, Naruto found himself trapped in another dome. This time, it was made out of mirrored ice. The sky grew thick with gray clouds and the moonlight faded. It began to snow. Though Zabuza had disappeared into the mist, Kakashi could sense the thick bloodthirst churning in the vicinity. He knew what was coming. Silent killing, it was one of the most feared assassination techniques. He didn't fear for his own life, however. The greater risk was to Tazuna. Though the older man's composure up to this point was remarkable, his fear was becoming increasingly tangible. "Don't worry, Tazuna-san," said Kakashi, making a reassuring smile. "You're in my charge now. I won't let you die." It was then that Zabuza chose to strike. "I wonder about that." Seemingly out of nowhere, the missing Nin materialized behind Tazuna, raising his sword to deliver the finishing blow, but Kakashi had been waiting. His Sharingan glowing, he turned around and plunged his kunai straight into the man's chest. It was not blood but water that dripped down the handle and fell to the ground. Another Zabuza emerged from the mist behind Kakashi, and the water clone he had struck instead melted away. Letting out a roar, Zabuza swung his sword in a formidable arc, cleaving Kakashi's body cleanly in two. For a moment, his eyes gleamed with triumph, which then turned into confusion, as the Jonin's body also melted away into water. "Don't move." Kakashi held a kunai to the missing Nin's neck, his Sharingan fixed on his target. "It's over." And yet, Zabuza looked far from defeated. "Clever. You used your Sharingan to mimic my hiding in mist technique. But if you think that's enough, you're sorely mistaken." Once more, another Zabuza materialized behind them. Kakashi stiffened in alarm as the clone he'd been holding hostage dissipated. It had been a trick within a trick, before raising his steel-plated gloves up just in time to block the coming blow. They stood at a standstill, sword grinding against steel. Their bodies shook from the tremendous force being put in on both ends, and then they burst apart, each leaping away from the other. As Kakashi landed, he felt something cold and wet land on the tip of his nose. It took him a second to process what it was. Snow. For some reason, the snow seemed to give Zabuza pause. When he moved again, he was visibly shaken, and Kakashi seized the opportunity. As the missing Nin raised a hand into the air to start his technique, Kakashi mirrored his motion. Before the other could react, the Jonin's hands blurred, finishing the jutsu he had been about to start. Suetun, Daibakufu no Jutsu, water style, great waterfall technique. Zabuza reeled back in shock. A muddy vortex of water rose up and claimed him. The earlier fight against Shirakumo must have drained Haiden more than Rai had expected, for the missing Nin's movements seemed sluggish. As Sai provided backup, they eventually managed to corner the missing Nin. With a lunge, Rai drove his kunai blade into Haiden's back, twisting it deep into his heart. Any ordinary person would have been long dead by now, but Haiden looked irritated instead. "I've told you, it's useless." Reaching back, he grabbed Rai and forcefully hurled him into the air. Flying backwards, the chain connecting Rai's blades clinked in the wind and suddenly, it gave him an idea. It all happened in an instant. Even as Sai's ink snakes swarmed him, Haiden lobbed his scythe after Rai. It whistled through the air, its 3 blades gleaming. He had a choice to make, and he made it. Even as the scythe plunged into his own chest, Rai used his remaining strength to throw his remaining kunai blade back at Haiden. Momentarily immobilized, Haiden watched the chains wrap tightly around his body, the blade still lodged in his back acting as an anchor. Finally, the chains ran out and the swinging kunai blade sliced straight through Haiden's neck, decapitating him. "Let's see you recover from that." Rai grinned, and his body hit the ground. By the time the water released Zabuza, slamming him against the ground and receding from around his body, the missing nin was spent. Kakashi held a kunai to his neck and at last, Zabuza bowed his head in defeat. "It's over," Kakashi said coldly. "Now tell me, where are my students?" Zabuza's face twisted. He opened his mouth. 2 kunai slammed into his neck, hitting his vital points in a splash of blood. The man didn't stand a chance, he was dead before Kakashi could even grasp what was going on. Alarmed, he immediately turned in the direction the kunai had come from. He had not noticed the presence of anyone else, and yet there, in the creeping fog, a figure in an orange mask stared down at Kakashi. Who the hell is that? The Hunter Nin's reflection surrounded Naruto on all sides, the white masks looming down at him. Every reflection gripped the bloody stump of its arm and gritted out in an echo, "You can't escape, not from my mirrors." Once more, Naruto heard the shrill sound of metal as dozens of needle senbon filled the air. This time, there were too many to counter. Even as he batted away the majority with his tanto, several broke through his guard, cutting through his cheeks and legs. It was curious how, despite the grim situation, Naruto didn't feel the slightest trace of fear. He hadn't realized it, but his mind had been growing dull with doubt like an unsharpened blade, ever since he had left Konoha for Wave Country. All that was gone now. There was a razor sharpness in its place, and he knew exactly what to do next. Opening his guard, Naruto brought his hands together to form a seal. Even as a dozen needles pierced his newly exposed arms, with a cloud of smoke, several shadow clones appeared and immediately began to guard him. Metal met metal in the background. Ignoring the pain, Naruto focused on the churning ball of chakra forming in the palm of his hand. He had thought that combining both shape and nature transformation was an impossible task, like trying to look in 2 different directions at once. In the new clarity of his mind, he realized now that his mistake had been in focusing too much on a single direction. He didn't have to look in 2 directions at the same time, he only had to widen his perspective. The tightly focused ball in his hand spun wildly. Strong gusts of wind began to spiral out. Stepping forward, Naruto slammed his Rasengan into the mirrors, and with an ear-splitting sound, they shattered into thousands of ice particles. When the air had cleared, the Hunter Nin lay unconscious on the ground. For a moment, Naruto held the blade of his tanto against the other ninja's neck, thinking. Then, he let his blade drop away. Leaving the Hunter Nin's body behind, Naruto began to make his way down to the cliff's base. He could acknowledge it now, neither Mayu nor Tazuna were here. It was time to come to terms with the fact that, despite their best efforts, they were going to come out of this empty-handed. The first thing Naruto saw was Shirakumo's body, still warm to the touch. He checked its pulse, and reaching a negative, stood up. And then he saw it, there, illuminated in the moonlight, was another body. His heart pounding in his ears, Naruto felt the last of the air in his lungs leave in a slow exhale. Rai! At the sound of Naruto's voice, Rai stirred. He had been fighting to stay awake long enough to wait for him. There was something heavy weighing him down, and he struggled to lift his head. The clouds must have covered the moon again, for everything was dark. Mayu? He asked. Did you find her? There was a pause. I found her. She's right here. Intense relief flooded what Rai could still feel of his limbs. Tears welling up in his eyes, he let his head fall back. He knew he had lost too much blood. The darkness was coming for him. He had no regrets. He had fulfilled his duty to his village. He had gotten his revenge for Yugakure. And with Naruto around, Mayu would be safe. He had no regrets. No, that wasn't exactly right. He did have one regret left. Shit. I wish I could have seen Kakashi-sensei's face at least once. Rai let out a rattling laugh, and with that, he died. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.